Okay, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Amy. Good afternoon. Thank you to all who are joining us for the first time and those who are returning for another session of our Workforce Collaborative Training Series. Today, we're very excited to have our own Sarah Bonk with us, LMSW, Mental Health Emergency Response Disaster Coordinator with Erie County, our Department of Mental Health, and she is going to talk to us about psychological first aid, a primer. Just a few quick reminders. At the end of this session, we'll be asking you to complete a very brief evaluation. We hope that you take a minute or two to fill this out so we can continue to improve our training series. We are finalizing details for our February session, so be on the lookout for registration information, which will be coming out soon. Please note, announcements for our future sessions will be sent out from our new email address. Or as always, you can go to the erie.gov/mental health website for these announcements and registration information as well. Our new email address is the ECDMH training collaborative@erie.gov. The recording and slides from today's presentation will be posted to our website within the next few days. Presentations and recordings from our past offerings are posted on our website as well, so we encourage you to check those out. We've just completed our 4th year of our training series and are looking at filling out our calendar for 2025. We're interested in hearing what topics and speakers you would all like to hear from. If you're interested in doing a 1-hour presentation, or if there's a particular topic you'd like to know more about, please indicate that on our evaluation, or you can email Amy at amy.rockwood@erie.gov. Our training today is being recorded and everyone is muted. I'll be monitoring the chat during the presentation, and Sarah will take questions as we go. So please put any questions that you have in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us today. And I'd like to introduce Sarah to talk about psychological first aid, a primer. Thanks, Sarah. It's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kathleen, and welcome everybody. I am excited to talk a little bit about psychological first aid and what that really can do for us as a response community, really when it comes to resilience. But I did think it was important just to kind of outline where I'm able to speak from when it comes to this experience, particularly when we're talking about disaster and emergency response. So the majority of my history comes from working in the nonprofit sector in our mental health community. But really, it was the experience I had when working at the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services that I really was able to see the value and the need for a robust psychological first aid party as a part of a critical incident response model that really could wrap around the county. So I just wanted to make sure that today we really make it clear what we're talking about. I am going to be discussing what psychological first aid is and at the core, really what those principles are that make up what it is as an intervention. This is not going to be a training where you would be able to walk away with a certificate of completion that you took psychological first aid, as I technically do not have my train the trainer for that just yet. This is really intended to set that stage and build interest in psychological first aid as a training. It's important to recognize too that psychological first aid is a intervention that is recognized by FEMA, is something that can be reimbursable for its service. So because of that, and for a couple other reasons, it makes it a really attractive intervention as a system for us to deploy and ensure that we have trainers who are ready to apply, as that last bullet point says, the application of psychological first aid. I'm also going to show a video for about 5 or 6 minutes of what psychological first aid looks like in terms of its direct application to community members. And I really do, as Kathleen said, encourage folks to ask questions. It's really something that it makes me connected to you folks and lets me know that you are listening. So in a nutshell, it's important to understand what psychological first aid is. And it really is a brief intervention that's geared specifically, was created for individuals experiencing stress or extreme stress due to a crisis, emergency, or trauma. Its roots actually started in the early 1900s after World War I, and its primary goal is to facilitate the stabilization of physiological functioning so that we can allow folks to use the tools that they they have to promote their own recovery and resiliency at their speed. And that's really why the model itself is focused on the strengths of the individual. Part of the benefit of that is that anybody who delivers psychological first aid as an intervention does not need to be a licensed or certified professional. Because the intervention is focused on stabilization and ensuring that we are using the tools and the strengths that the individual identifies, it's an intervention that can be delivered on a one-to-one basis, no matter what an individual's degree or training or experience is prior to delivering it. It also is a training that does teach those who take it to identify the acute signs of stress. It does discuss some of the symptomology of post-traumatic stress disorder, though it is not the main focus of the education. It's really intended to help individuals screen out what are those normalized experiences or reactions to disaster, and then what in those early intervention moments, if identified, a higher level of need, what do we do to refer that individual and make sure we get them to the right level of care at the right time is a really important part of psychological first aid. So there are a couple of primary goals. When it comes to psychological first aid, the core is really to ensure that the responders who are delivering the psychological intervention are there really to support the ongoing mental health recovery for the individuals that we're meeting. It's intended to foster their continued resiliency. And one of the things that can make that a bit complicated for new responders is that our obligation in emergency response is to ensure that we restore individuals to pre-disaster conditions. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult if we are meeting a person who was experiencing homelessness prior to a disaster. Technically, our obligation is to return them to that place post-disaster. But what can we do in that in-between to ensure that they have the skills, the resources to maybe promote that space and actually move through the state of recovery as opposed to just being stuck in that cycle? So it sounds like a tall order, as I just described it, when we're looking at promoting recovery and resiliency, and when we're really looking at getting to the root of what an individual's experience is. But I do just want to stress that really what we're talking about is how to alleviate acute distress through communication. And that is the other foundational aspect of psychological first aid that makes it really helpful and creative in its implementation, is that it's teaching the effective communication techniques, the ones that are critical for relaying real-time and accurate information when we're interacting with an individual. And as I had mentioned, the beauty of psychological first aid is that it was designed to be given and received no matter what that level of professional attainment is for individuals. And in addition, it also is teaching folks how to tailor those intervention and those responses so that they can really address the unique needs of various populations, especially when we're talking about children, elderly, or those who may be experiencing disability. That is going to be much more difficult in a disaster scenario. And so part of that training in psychological first aid is teaching the responder how to work and maneuver through those challenges in a disaster response. Additionally, it's really important, and it's all over the curriculum of psychological first aid, that the goal of that first responder, when they build connection with an individual they're talking to, is to foster a sense of safety, hope, and calm. You know, it can be a really stressful time in those 4 to 6 hours or 4 to 24 hours after a disaster, and the spectrum of emotions that folks can go through can vary. So it's really incumbent upon the responder or the individual delivering psychological first aid to work to demystify those emotions, to normalize what's appropriate for the individual. And those are the concepts taught during the curriculum. It's also important to know how we as responders can validate survivors' thoughts and feelings. And there's a way to do that without overpromising hope, but while maintaining connectedness. And that's a real working part of the curriculum that they have individuals practice as they go through psychological first aid. And part of why it makes, part of what makes psychological first aid and intervention appropriate to be delivered by a variety of individuals is because it's not diagnosing. what it's doing is it's really assisting the individual with problem solving, meeting them where they are at in that moment through a fostered sense of safety, calm, and hope, and then promoting that resiliency and then using their own strengths to move forward through the rest of the disaster. The other big goal of psychological first aid is to ensure that we're helping connect folks to the right support systems. Building part of psychological first aid is receiving the training, but the other part of psychological first aid is ensuring that the response is involved at a community level, so that the skill of being able to kind of be plunked into a disaster scenario and be able to liaison with various groups and individuals is important in those disaster environments. We may be sent there to deliver psychological first aid, but then we may find that we have to advocate with a faith-based group to come into where we are delivering psychological first aid, because maybe there are some individuals who need some spiritual resources. So while the training is teaching us to manage and help individuals manage acute stress, it's also teaching us how we can be effective liaisons and advocates with individuals. Another important part of the curriculum is teaching responders how to manage their own stress. And we'll talk a little bit about how we in the mental health field can kind of work on that and integrate some of the skills we may already have into this space. But this becomes even more important and relevant when we talk about responders managing our own stress prior to burnout, because we just can't be there and be helpful in the way that we need to if we really aren't working on our self-care prior to our response.
One quick question for you,
Yeah.
Sarah, that just came in. Hi, Margaret. Margaret Vargas sent in a question. Is this the program that LMSW did last year as part of the recast program?
That's a very good question. And I got to be honest with you, I am not 100% sure, Margaret, because I don't know about the last year's program, but I can tell you this is different than the current programming that Governor Hochul's office is pushing out. This is different than mental health first aid, which we'll get into. Not sure about that specific program, but I would be happy to look into that and get back to you on that one.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And so really just kind of rounding out those goals, those core principles when it comes to psychological first aid. At the end of the day, there are the core principles that we are looking to instill in folks who do take the training is understanding how to instill safety and stabilization through calming, comforting, listening, compassion, and understanding. And that is meant to foster hope and empowerment for the individual as they do move through a disaster scenario. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about successful deliveries of psychological first aid. The reason why the training is focused on the strengths of the individual outside of what we know is the benefit of strength-based perspective is because the context of disasters can vary widely. We know that there are disasters currently that are categorized by their origins. We have natural disasters, technological disasters such as big hacking or cyber attacks. We also have experienced human-made disasters such as trail derailments or things kind of that nature. What we've also learned is that each type of disaster carries with it its own respective type of psychological stressors, and that requires a tailored approach and a tailored response from those that may be going to deliver that psychological first aid. And really what that means when we talk about providing a tailored approach in a disaster setting, that's meaning the responders are well aware of the cultural context, the disaster context, and the causes, and they are there and they're focused to guide those individuals and to help mitigate the impacts of experiencing that disaster. So it's important that while we understand psychological first aid is something that can be delivered to everyone, the context of that delivery is something that is really important. Did I just see a question come in,
Yep.
Kathleen?
Another question that came in.
Yeah.
From Jamie Lynn, can it be like someone passing away?
Great question. Yeah, it can. And they actually, within the training, I'll admit, it's a good question. I don't get a ton into grief work specifically, but there is absolutely a lot of research on the application of psychological first aid within the grief space. and I wish I could talk more about it because as I was preparing, I was reading through some of that material and screening it out. So admittedly, I didn't even retain it, but if you'd like to send me an email, I would be happy to get you more information on the application of psychological first aid within grief. Because to that point, grief is a very heavy and relevant theme in our community right now. We have been through a lot. The the Tops shooting, the blizzard, which killed 47 people, and a whole host of other deaths in between are real traumas that we collectively have gone through as a community. And so when we look at how do we manage these things and promote resiliency, tackling grief really is a part of that. Oh, and look at that actually was kind of a nice segue into the next point, talking about community and talking about that context of disasters. Feelings and the expression of emotions may look very different in a group who have experienced a man-made disaster than a group who may have experienced a flash flood. And everywhere, in particular here in Erie County, we have very different levels of vulnerabilities. So what I mean by that is there may not be a flash flood that is very likely to occur, but what else can we say about our local weather, our local regional sort of patterns and systems that may make certain things more likely to happen? And those are the things that we start to target behind the scenes to make sure that we're building that resiliency for. But that understanding of local context means a lot in terms of how we target and hone in on those responses, particularly when we're trying to ensure that we're addressing the needs of the community who have experienced the disaster. So one of the good things that the training does is break it down into very tangible and deliverable items. Like how can we effectively be providing safety and stability for an individual? That can sometimes be a bit of a complicated task, especially if we're being thrust into a response scenario. But again, what we're really talking about is taking a step back and taking it back to basics. Is how do we ensure safety and stabilization? We need to ensure physical safety. So does this person have water? Do they need food? Do they look like they are okay? If they need something physically, we have to shuffle them off in the response and get them some medical attention. But we have to then kind of triage that and say, okay, if I have folks that I can interact with that are physically safe, I'm physically safe. What can I do? Who can I step in? Is there someone within this crowd or kind of this position that might be experiencing immediate emotional distress that you can assist with? And part of that is also teaching you how to use what's available. Sometimes when you're asked to respond, you're going to a scene that is not prepared to be specifically used for a mental health response. So we may not have noise machines or privacy or those sorts of things. So we want to kind of take a scan and see what are the things available that I can use to assist us in our delivery of psychological first aid. And that's some of the things that the training is providing. It's also talking about common comfort, really teaching us those practical techniques for individuals in disaster context, looking at, okay, how do we reconnect somebody's emotions with their body to make it more likely that they're to process their experience and kind of store it away in their memory appropriately. That involves that deep breathing and kind of involving our bodily processes. And we teach that in psychological first aid. We also want to ensure that we know what resources are available, so we're keeping those promises appropriate and not over-promising things. I hope, as we all know, a big part of ensuring those communication skills is active listening. It becomes even more important in a disaster scenario because, again, as we'll talk in a little bit, that range of reactions might vary widely. And so our duty to pay attention, to listen actively is really important, especially when we're trying to communicate empathy as opposed to sympathy. Sometimes it's hard. It's hard to be empathetic if we can't always find something to relate to when it comes to individuals. But that's why the key component of empathy is to really listen in to the emotional experience of the individual. So you may not have had to go through a house fire or a disaster yourself, but your understanding of what total loss may feel like is how we can build that connection and communication with individuals. And as we get into that connection and support, it's really not even about what we're doing as the responder for that person. It's really about the skills that they have and how we take their skills and link them to the appropriate community resources so that they can continue to elevate themselves into a position that is a recovery out of that disaster. And the support systems that are available that have been identified by that person, not the resources that we identify for them, but the resources that are identified as supportive by the individual are really important for us to focus on in those interactions. And how do we build community around someone? How do we allow them to see the resources that may or may not be available so that they can use those as they move forward in that recovery? And then, of course, last but not least, and arguably sometimes a little tricky, is empowerment and hope as a core principle of psychological first aid. You know, it's important to be mindful of hope. It's important to not suggest hope when there isn't any, because we may be responding in capacities where there really is no way for an individual to see hope. But to foster where within them it can feel a little less painful, where within them hope may exist or things could change, are the type of responses we are teaching to follow through. And where we can instill hope for the future, if hope isn't a viable option for an individual, it's important that we align ourselves with that hope and encourage that movement towards the things we need to do to get there.
A question that came in while you were talking, Sarah,
Yeah.
from Max. Are our elected officials given this training?
Oh, that is a great question. No, with a caveat. I'm thinking, sorry, nothing's shorting out on you on the computer. So I was thinking, I'm thinking about a time, I don't know of a time that this training has been offered to elected officials. So that's why I say no, caveat. I'm not sure it's been offered to them. They are aware though of this resource. The reason I say that is because each municipality has an emergency manager or is likely to have an emergency manager that they're working with. And this is a resource that exists within an incident command structure of a disaster response. So they may not know about it directly. They may not know the utility of it or the specifics, but there may be some awareness to that, if that answers that question. That's a good question. I like it. All right, so just rounding out those core principles, really, as I feel like I've been harping on it a little bit, but it's ensuring that the responders who are delivering psychological first aid are responding to guide the individual to use their internal supportive resources. And yes, that can be difficult when folks don't have a lot of internal resources. Yes, that can be difficult when folks have not had resources prior to the disaster, but we really are in a position to work with what we have, because we can't make false promises, we can't make false hope. So we are there to sit with that individual until we find those resources within themselves that we can use to empower them. So I had mentioned psychological first aid does teach about the, stress reactions, acute stress response. It's also teaching about some of the red flags to pay attention to. However, again, I just wanted to reiterate, it is non-diagnostic. So when we are talking about psychological first aid, the framework of post-traumatic stress disorder from the DSM is not really something that we're focused on, except for when it comes to timelines and how people may be impacted. But we are really teaching folks to resist that urge to diagnose and just look at the totality of the circumstance and the totality of the individual. Meaning, what are their psychological and emotional reactions that they're having? And that range can be pretty wide when it comes to disaster and critical incident response. You know, we can see apathy and emotional numbing. We can also see some impatience and emotional lability, where we see people kind of varying between different states of emotional experience. And for a certain amount of time, up to 72 hours or so, that's considered normal. And it's part of our job to make sure we are weaving through those things, providing that education, as I had mentioned earlier, demystifying that emotional experience. And when I say that, this training is teaching us to say, hey, it's okay. It's only been 24 hours. It's normal to feel numb. Those are the sorts of kind of communication techniques we're talking about when it comes to psychological first aid. Additionally, we're looking at physical and behavioral reactions. So psychological first aid teaches us some of those things, again, to look out for, to screen for. So looking to see if folks are experiencing any jumpiness or agitation. And it's also empowering us to provide some psychoeducation to individuals, talking about how when we experience stress and trauma, we may have an increased desire for sweets, carbs, alcohol, maladaptive coping skills. So it's giving us that language and framework to be able to, again, demystify that experience of emotions after a disaster. It also teaches us when we need to start thinking about bringing in additional layers of help. And again, through that psychoeducation, we are telling folks, we have that window of 72 hours. If symptoms are persisting past that, here's who you may want to reach out to. And so that training at its core is looking at how we use the dailies of activities, of daily living in combination with the emotional experience as a way to measure and gauge safety for an individual, but also teach that individual to use those same skills, tools, and resources to gauge that for themselves when they leave our care or our intervention. So the idea is when an individual walks away, they know that there are 72 hours where they should be really expecting a fluctuation in their experience. Those are the things that are helpful to tell people. And of course, probably most importantly, psychological first aid is teaching us the importance of being attuned to cultural and individual differences. This is a time where people may question spirituality or faith. And we see that individuals will have increased needs around understanding. And it's our job to make sure that we're providing some of those for people. Kathleen, did I see a question come in, or am I?
Yep, a comment and then a question. The first one was a comment, and that is many of the first responders in the area have attended mental health first aid through our Endeavor training program. Not the same training, but covers some of the same topics. Yep. And then the question was, how do you handle misdirected anger at the responder?
That is a great question. And it's actually something that we practice in psychological first aid, but it's a tough one because a part of our job is to absorb some of that, which is why our self-care becomes so important, because misdirected anger is a very common response after disaster scenarios. I can think, of my own scenarios in life where maybe I've had some misdirected anger, and that really falls within what's normal. So this may not be the best answer, but knowing that as responders, knowing that we may go into spaces where we're encountering folks who have misdirected, misguided, however we want to coin it, anger, we kind of need to be prepared for that. So still being able to sit with that anger, assuming that person is not lashing out at us physically or becoming violent, of course. But if not, then part of us needs to sit there and listen. And part of us needs to acknowledge, work with, and redirect. And I say that very easily, and I know that that's not going to be perfect every time, and it's not always going to work, but sometimes it takes just really being there and being present. But good question. And if you have more specifics, I'd love to touch base on those, so thank you for the question. So as I have kind of mentioned, that range of expression for emotion after disaster, crisis, and emergencies is really, really wide. We see that for folks of all populations and cultures, and it's really normal to experience changes in our body, whether it's headaches or stomach aches or some of those different cravings, as I had mentioned. Those are the sorts of things that the education of psychological first aid is empowering us to give to individuals as we are interacting in disaster scenarios. And the other beauty of the training that I like is because it's looking at disaster response from a non-diagnostic perspective, it's teaching that if there is any expression of suicide or concerns around self-harm, they are to the individual responders to bring in that supervisor that's on site within that disaster response. So there's a whole framework of how we respond and we work together, and that's another big component of the training. So just a couple other things that are really important. Psychological first aid is an evidence-informed approach, again, designed to reduce that initial distress and foster short and long-term adaptive functioning after a disaster. And that's really important. Because of that, that's what allows for psychological first aid to be a reimbursable intervention within disaster scenarios. And Resiliency and recovery are they are the basis of what we are talking about. And so when we go to engage individuals and we go to walk through psychological first aid, it's really some of those things that I talked about: assessing the situation, engaging our own mental preparedness beforehand. The training goes into a lot of detail about some of the things we need to pay attention to as responders, the things that maybe may or may not shape whether we're able to respond. And it's also important, if we can, to gather what credible information is available. So oftentimes when you respond to deliver psychological first aid, you'll see that there's an entrance point where you have to sign in, and there will be a lot of information and available there. And the training will be teaching those that take it those sorts of things. It's also important too, as I had discussed, when we're walking into these situations to deliver psychological first aid, looking for those signs of distress, what signs of distress are maybe more of concern than others. Also trying to take in a gather of how many folks may need the service, and if we have to bring in more responders, that is something that we are encouraging responders to be able to ask for when they're on scene. And it's really, again, reinforcing that active, non-intrusive listening, and that can be hard. And that's why taking the time to assess where we are is really, really important. It's important to allow the survivors to share the stories at their own pace, but it's also important so that we're allowing that connection of support and connectivity to grow so that we can, again, empower that individual to use their resources. So I'm going to play this video. I've talked a lot of game up to this point about what's going to happen and what these disaster scenarios should look like. It's a little hard, though, to conceptualize, especially if you haven't had the experience to respond in a live environment. So I'm going to play this video. We'll only watch about 5 minutes or so of it. I'm going to skip ahead. You'll hear a woman give you a little bit of what to expect as we're watching, and then we're going to watch a couple minutes of it, and then I will pause it. If you have questions that come up while we're watching it, please throw them in the chat, and then I'll have Kathleen go over any questions if they come up when I press pause. So we'll go from there.
I will be participating as an observer in the psychological first aid demonstrations. We'll also be providing feedback at the end. Here's our scenario. A strain of influenza has been spreading nationally, and an outbreak has been reported on the college campus. This strain is particularly dangerous for young, healthy people. Now, several students have been hospitalized, and there's talk of a student having died from the flu, but this hasn't been confirmed. In collaboration with the local Department of Health, a point of dispensing operation, also known as a pod, has been established at the gym on the campus, and campus administrators are strongly encouraging students to get their vaccinations. Let's see what happens.
Wow. How long do you think they're going to have us wait here?
I don't know. I didn't expect the line to be this long. I guess it's good people are showing up. I just hope the line goes fast so we can grab lunch before we go to class.
Or we could just bail and go to lunch now.
No, we're getting the vaccination.
Why are you being so bossy about this?
Because I study public health, and I learned all about how the 1918 flu killed more people than World War I. And most of them were young and healthy, just like what's happening now. I don't want to die before I finish grad school.
Okay. I really don't like getting shots. And it's so hot in here, and why are they supposed to tell us avoid crowded places, and now they have us all crammed together in this stupid gym?
Dad, no one likes getting shots. It's better than dying.
I'm sorry, did you just say something about dying?
Yeah, it's no problem. We were just talking about how this flu is really dangerous for people our age, so it's really important we get the shot.
Really, I was just reading on Facebook an article that said that people are actually dying from the vaccinations. Apparently they're making it weird, and there's like making it poisonous or something like that. Have you heard that? Hold on, I'm not letting someone inject poison into my arm.
Okay, you're not leaving.
Hey guys, I'm Karen. I work for the college. Can I give you some water? I know it's really hot.
Yes, keep it. I'm leaving.
Oh, what's wrong? Are you okay?
No. My so-called friend here is trying to convince me to get a shot, and I just found out people who are getting it are dying. Well, that's what I heard. I don't know that it's true.
Yeah, there's so many rumors going around. It's really not helping the whole situation. Vaccination is being made exactly the same way this year as it always is. I know a lot of college students don't bother to get the annual flu shot, even though it's recommended for you. But I bet all your parents and grandparents get it every year, and they're fine, right?
Right. See, Cynthia, it's perfectly safe.
I don't know. I don't get why this is necessary. I've never even had the flu before.
It is. Unfortunately, this year it's a different kind of strain. It's very unusual, but it's attacking people with the strongest immune systems, which generally means healthy young people. So that's why it's so important that we're trying to get all of these students protected so you don't actually get the disease.
A bunch of people on this team have gotten it already, I heard. And then there is, I saw a person last night get taken by ambulance last night.
Oh my God. Is he okay? Is he gonna die?
All we know at this point is that a student was hospitalized yesterday. It hasn't been confirmed yet if it was flu, but it's just another example of why it's so important that everyone get this vaccination so that that doesn't happen to you.
This is really scary. I didn't think this would be a problem for us students.
It is scary, I understand that, but again, we're trying to protect everybody. And I know there's a lot of misinformation out there. Tell you what, I'm going to give you this really good pamphlet that the college put together. It's got a lot of facts about the flu itself, about the vaccination and safety, and addressing some of those rumors that you've been hearing. Take a few minutes and read that over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and steal you some snacks and some cold drinks from the break room. I'm going to come back in a few minutes with those so you can keep your strength up while you're waiting in line. And in the meantime, think of any questions, and I'll come back and try and answer them or get answers for you if I don't know. Does that sound good?
Great. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, you're going to be here when I get back?
Yeah, you convinced me.
Okay, good. All right, I'll be back in a few.
All right. So that is a pretty good demonstration of a psychological first aid application. So Kathleen, did we have any questions that came in?
Yeah, we have one question that came in. How do you deal with misinformation?
Oh, it's a great question. So I'm going to speak to that within the disaster context specifically. The reason I say that is because that's the one I can kind of answer that question the most clearly. When we have an operation, that's what we call the formalization of providing a resource to a community. So when there's a disaster and we need an operation to deliver recovery or resources, that operation then, oh my gosh, Kathleen, I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question for me?
Sure. How do you deal with misinformation?
Oh, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure. I was like, ooh.
Yep.
So that operation has an incident command. That incident command is putting out a series of briefings and a series of reports or information that will be the most updated, most real-time and tangible. It can be difficult though when we're trying to deliver what we have been given as the credible information to convince other people of the fact that like this is the most credible information I have. I don't have anything else. And sometimes it's really just being honest with people and saying like, you know, I can see there's a ton of misinformation going out there. This is what I've been provided as the most factual information. You know, we're taught to go based off of this. I can't confirm anything that comes outside of this information channel, and just acknowledging that it's there and it's present, but not getting into a prove or disprove sort of conversation with people. Just acknowledging, moving along, providing the information that you've been given is probably the best advisable way to get through that. But good question. So
that was the only question I see, Sarah. Yep, I was just saying that's the only question I see.
Okay, awesome. So that was an example of what psychological first aid looks like. You know, I have some thoughts about maybe the tone or some feedback I'd like to kind of contribute. But in general, when we talk about expectations or depth of conversation, that provides a really good example of what we're talking about and teaching individuals to do in the training. It's also, though, important to have a really good understanding and recognition of what individual ethical and professional boundaries are. Those are different, and sometimes there can be a little bit of a difference in between maybe code of ethics or what folks will ask of you in a disaster response. And that's why at really the beginning of the training, we look to incorporate our professional ethics and code of standards within this training so that those two can deliver it as a successful intervention. And it's important that we know our role, and that we're there for a very short time. We're really there to help to stabilize folks, and knowing that limitation is an important understanding of psychological first aid. And even though we're not diagnosing or providing a strictly clinical intervention, it's important that we are working to obtain consent to be able to engage with an individual. You know, if somebody's really adamant that they do not want to talk right now, we have to honor that. And maybe that means coming back to check in on them a little later. Maybe that means telling a site supervisor so that there is somebody to check in on them. But we do need to respect the concerns and the wishes of the individual, even in a disaster response. And it's important, especially for those that are carrying licenses, to make sure that we are being culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive. It's important for everybody, but there is a real ethical and professional obligation to do that in all of the work that we do when it comes to the delivery of psychological first aid. I think I saw a question pop up. I may not have.
Oh, yes, it's about slides. So the slides and recording from the presentation will be posted to our website within the next day or two.
Sure will. Good question. But then we do have to, I've mentioned this, and we do have to talk about it because it's really important. And I think if you were to ask me to talk about self-care 10 years ago, I would not be as enthusiastic to talk about it as I am now, because now I really can appreciate the value of day-to-day maintenance of self-care. And I'm not talking about taking weekend trips or going away on, whatever, those are great. But I'm talking about what are we doing on a day-to-day basis to maintain our own homeostasis. Traumatic and secondary stress is going to happen. How it impacts us is going to widely vary, but it's going to happen. And it's our job, and it's, in my opinion, part of our duty to ensure that we're doing the things necessary to maintain our own self-care so that we can be available for response. It makes it easier to be compassionate, and it helps us mitigate that compassion fatigue and that secondary traumatic stress. And also, it's really important for those that work in the mental health profession to understand that concept of death by 1,000 cuts, and that if we are not staying on top of the healing process of those cuts, sometimes the day-to-day grind, if you will, of listening to the stories of others can really slowly chip away at us. And so it's just really important. And I mentioned what self-care is. I have a picture of a bedroom up here because for me, self-care is cuddling with my dog in bed on an extended weekend. That's it. It's not the things that are overly self-indulgent or the things that allow us as an excuse to avoid responsibility. It's definitely not a sign of weakness. And I say that as somebody who I don't think I would have had that same perspective years ago. It's not an instant fix. It's something that we have to weave into our daily lives, weekly lives, even if that means sitting in the car for 10 minutes before we go into a house to try to put dinner on the table. What are those things that we're doing to maintain our homeostasis so that we can be available for those who need us most when they need us the most? And being attuned to those signs of emotional strain or fatigue also tells us a lot about when it's time to seek help and when we need to seek help. And psychological first aid does go over that, but I really wanted to reinforce this point today. Finally, in SAMHSA's release of their comprehensive crisis behavioral systems toolkit, they acknowledged that the mental wellness and suicide prevention among agency leadership is paramount in developing a crisis system that is responsive to the needs of the individuals. And that goes to say for us as interveners or folks who are providing psychological first aid, it's important that we have peer networks among ourselves within the response community, within the clinical community, within the peer community, and that we have the resources available to be able to sustain our own capacity. Did I see a question come in? May not have. Works for me.
A question.
Okay.
How do you handle people with various disabilities?
Good question. So I will answer the question widely just because it's kind of a wide question, but there's a lot of room to narrow in. We, meaning when we do a disaster response or we have an operation that is upstood to be able to deliver things, we have an access and functional needs resource coordinator. That is the individual whose job it is during an emergency operation to ensure that if we upstand a shelter, for example, we have the necessary ADA compliant requirements and a variety of other tools and resources necessary to meet some of those requirements. So we have an individual part of that disaster response model whose job it is to address those things specifically.
Another question that came in.
Yeah.
How can I help my daughter that is getting bullied? She's 10, is what it says.
Good question. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of resources. Might be helpful to follow up with an email because we might have some specific resources for you depending on the school district or kind of where some of that is happening. I would recommend, if you don't mind, reaching out to us via email. We might be able to tailor in some of those specific resources to you if that's okay. Is that all right, Kathleen, you think?
Sure, I can make sure I put your email in the chat.
Great. Awesome.
Thanks, Sarah.
So, forgive me there. So really, when we're talking about psychological first aid, what we're talking about is one intervention methodology that can be part of a big comprehensive crisis intervention suite of products, if you will. So in my opinion, psychological first aid makes a really wonderful marriage with mental health first aid. And as I believe it was Margaret had mentioned, they're kind of different in terms of what they go over, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they both really do have an intent to design that short-term helping process. When we look at crisis stabilization, or excuse me, when we look at crisis intervention, that is really looking at the short-term helping process that is looking at the acuteness of the scenario. When we're talking about psychological first aid, we're really talking about the term usage denote a variation on a theme of crisis intervention. So this is a specific type of crisis intervention. It's designed really to be a peer-to-peer, or and when I say peer-to-peer, I don't necessarily mean certified peer, but a training of peer responders. So community members responding to community members is what we're talking about in this context, because really we're trying to, as it says, enhance a community's capacity to be able to respond to itself. I have talked a little bit about in previous trainings, we all need to be prepared for 72 hours. There's a real likelihood that due to the nature of disasters, responders may not get to folks quick enough. And because of that, we need to make sure we are prepared as individuals. Psychological first aid is the way to ensure that we as communities are mentally fit, kind of ready, psychologically prepared to be able to respond and support one another. Mental health first aid, great training, still very helpful and incredibly insightful, is really aimed at teaching folks how to identify, understand, and respond to signs of mental illness and substance use disorders. Just as valuable and is a lovely supplement to really any crisis response training continuum. And so just in conclusion, right, this was a primer. So I really just hopefully got people thinking about questions, how they might be able to use psychological first aid, what settings it might be useful for the individual who asked the question about bullying. Psychological first aid is actually being utilized in North Carolina in the schools as a way to start teaching both schools and students how to build that sense of community amongst one another. They started it in response to the disasters, but they're actually finding that it's having some really positive impacts when it comes to bullying and some other behaviors for kids. So that's one of the really other kind of interesting research perks that is coming out of psychological first aid. And at the end of the day, we're here to deliver safety, calm, demonstrate that we're listening, linking folks to the appropriate resources that they need. And often those resources, because of the nature of the disaster, are provided to you in that response. So you'll know what's available to be able to share with an individual. And ultimately, at the end of the day, psychological first aid is there to help us understand our personal role in disaster and how we really do have the ability to provide that support and compassion for one another, and how we can use that compassion to make those appropriate referrals for folks in other settings if need be. And that is what I had for psychological first aid. Do we have any other questions, comments?
We do have a question that came in, but to
Right.
others, if you have questions, please put them in the chat because we do have some time here. The question that came in was, will you be rolling this out as a training in Erie County?
Good question. So we will be, and when I say we, I want to make sure I'm really clear that it is going to be a partnership between us and New York State. So New York State is running, and I don't have the details, but they're running some train the trainers for psychological first aid. So we will be providing the state support to provide that training to the county, and you'll be seeing offers of who wants to participate that in come from me, because in a perfect world, I'd have as many train the trainers and psychological first aid as we could. There are some, oh, you know what? And I'll put it in the chat because I did end a couple minutes early. There's a great online training for psychological first aid, and it comes with free CEUs for those who are interested. You can get up to 10 CEUs if you take this training, for free. And it is really, it's a great training. It takes about 5 hours, so it does take some time. I'm going to put the link in the chat, but this is an online version of psychological first aid as well.
Great, thanks. And I see another comment that came in from Margaret. If anyone is interested in mental health first aid for either adults or kids, and there's contact in there for Erin Quinn at Endeavor.
That's actually great to know, because we were talking with Amy about maybe we need to do some of that here too. So yes, that's very helpful information. Thank you, Margaret.
I see Sarah's link in there, and that is a great training. We've gotten good feedback from others, even in our office, that have taken it.
The other training that's available in that link is called psychological recovery skills. And that, oh no, I'm sorry, skills for psychological recovery. Also another 5 CEUs free class, just as incredible in terms of just breaking down how to be a little less clinical and how to really connect with folks in these settings.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Any other questions? I'm just scrolling through. I don't think I missed any. So I don't see any other questions that came in.
Yes, and Hope is who I'm acknowledging Natalie's comment. Hope is who I am working with my little puppy. She's not a puppy. That's who I'm working to get certified with. We're working towards that certification. So thank you for mentioning Hope. We love them.
You know what? There was one question that came in relation to, I think, the course you were talking about. Can anyone take that course?
Sure can. Yep. Anybody. You don't have to have any license or degree. Anybody can take the course. And I would encourage anybody to take the course too. So good question.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation. So much information that we can all use. Thanks again to Amy for coordinating, and thank you all for participating in our session today. Amy has pasted the link to our evaluation in the chat box, so please just take a moment and complete that for us. It won't take long. The recording and slides from today's presentation will be posted to our webpage within the next day or two. Be on the lookout for future notices, both for our February session and anything upcoming, but you can always check back at our website because that will have announcements and registration info as well. And again, if you're interested in being a presenter or you have a particular topic in mind that you'd like more information about, please let Amy know or put that on your evaluation, or you can email her. Thank you again to Sarah for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for being part of our collaborative. Have a great day.